through the day today. So very pleased today to welcome Professor Daryl O'Connor. So Daryl is a registered health psychologist. He's got strong research interest in psychobiology, and he'll be talking about what he refers to as the architecture of science and how science can improve its rigor, lessen use of questionable research practices, and reduce publication bias, with a move towards slow science and away from the publish or perish culture. So before I do pass on to Daryl, I just wanted to recap really. So we've been running these sessions, what we're calling the open lunch sessions, throughout this year, and we've had a sort of eventful year, I think, as a sector really, not just at Leeds, but we've certainly learned a lot. I personally learned a lot about open research this year. We started off with an event in October last year. Now this is recorded on YouTube if you want to catch up if you didn't manage to attend at the time. So if you just indulge me for a moment, I'm just going to sort of thank everybody really that's contributed to some of the talks we've had over this year. So as I say, that first event, which was called Beyond Open Access, How, Why and What's Next for Open Research at the University of Leeds, is available on YouTube. And we had an introduction there from the Vice-Chancellor and their keynote from Professor Duncan Wingham, and contributions from Dr. Ika Rink, who I know is here today, and Kelly Lloyd, who's also here today, and Dr. Bernadette Moore. So thank you to those for that event. And then starting in February, well, just to say, as part of that event, we did actually launch a survey, which is still open and available, taking responses. So this was to explore attitudes towards open research practices across the University of Leeds. So if you are a member of the University of Leeds staff or PGR, that is still available to fill in. So please do take it shouldn't take more than sort of 10 minutes to do. Really important, interesting, useful to inform our response as a university, in terms of open research. Perhaps a colleague can post the link in there and we can actually access it on the screen. That was in conjunction with Dr. Ika Rink, who is the local lead for the UK Reproducibility Network. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment as well. And also with the backing of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation Plan. And this is all about ensuring the efficiency, reliability and reproducibility of research that I think Albert tells us a lot more about today. So to quickly just sort of recap and sort of thank some of who may be here today for some of the talks we've had this year. So we started off in February with a talk on preprints and open peer review in different disciplines with Professor Cecilia Catt and Dr. Chris Waring, two very different disciplines represented there. So Cecilia is a linguist, I think, and Dr. Chris Waring is an astrophysicist, I think. So that was interesting to sort of see the different perspectives from two different disciplines. Then in March, we had Tools for Reproducible Research with Alex Coleman. He's a research software engineer from the computing team here at Leeds, and PGR Daniel Dalton. So thank you to them for that one. In April, I think we're getting my months right. These are all available to follow up with online. Most of them are recorded. The first one wasn't recorded, but the rest are all recorded. And again, you can't hit the links, but there's a link at the top there for the Leeds blog, the library blog, where you can access the blog post with links to the recording. So in April, we had Dr. Victoria Spacer talking about open reproducible research in social sciences. It's often perhaps associated with STEM. So that was really interesting from Victoria, how it relates to her discipline. And one after that was in May with, we had an external speaker for that. So thanks to Professor Hugh Shanahan from Royal Holloway, University of London, who's a professor of open science at Royal Holloway. He did a talk, was joined by Dr. Marlene Mangoni from School of Mechanical Engineering here at Leeds, talking about some of the barriers to practicing open research. So that's certainly one worth catching up with if you didn't manage to attend that one. And the most recent one prior to today was, again, with external speakers, Sonia Towers from the Wellcome Trust, giving a bit of a funder's perspective on open research and why it's important for the Wellcome Trust, with a case study from Robert Smith, who was doing a PhD funded by the Wellcome Trust at the University of Sheffield. So, as I say, sort of as close as I can get to a public thank you to all of those speakers, and we are hoping to run more of these events in the new academic year. So if you've got any ideas, or if you'd like to talk at these events, then please do get in touch and let us know. They were great resources as much as anything else. As I say, we tried to write these up on the blog. I've certainly learned an awful lot. It's informing our position as a library, as a central service in the university. What our role is in supporting open research. So there's a little bit of stuff on the website. We're still sort of developing that, and again trying to liaise with colleagues across the university to figure out exactly what open research means to us as an organisation, and what are the roles of various stakeholders are in that. So just to flag up, this research culture group, you may be aware of the recent appointment of Dr. Kat Davis as Dean of Research Culture, so I think she'll have an interest in this area. Be setting up an open research subgroup as a proposal to feed up to that research culture group. I've already mentioned the UK Reproducibility Network, so I know Arca's here. There is a link there. I know Arca's intending to launch a Microsoft team very soon. If you're interested in joining that, UKRN is a national peer-led consortium looking at the factors that contribute to robust research, and it's been a really important sort of grassroots organisation over the past 12 months. And just to flag up the Reproducibility Journal Club as well, Kelly Lloyd's been sort of instrumental in leading that. I know she's on the call today, so and everybody's welcome to those. And again, I've certainly learned a lot from attending those myself. I'll rattling on a bit, so I'll hand over to Del, but just to mention some of the other initiatives related to this. I've emphasised that it's sort of, it is included in the library strategy for the university as a whole. The responsible metrics is part of this discussion as well. So you may or may not be aware that the university, as many have, as is actually required by some funders, including Welcome, have signed up to the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment. You can sign that as an individual as well if you like. And this is about their tagline: "Let's change what we value in research." And not relying on emphasising general impact factor in this country. And just to flag up at this point that we do actually have scheduled another event like this with Professor Stephen Curry, who's based at Imperial and is the chair of DORA. So that has been confirmed for the 9th of September, but we don't have any more details, but just sort of bear that in mind, and hopefully we'll record that, and that should be an interesting event. Probably the first one after August. We'll have a break for August. So with that, I shall pass over to Daryl and just say thank you to him ahead of his talk. And thanks, Daryl. I'll pass on to you, and looking forward to what you're going to tell us.
Thanks, Nick. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so people can just confirm you can see those slides. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see them.
Great.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys. Okay, so lovely to be here, and it's kind of weird. We're speaking at our own university, but yet many of us have not been in it since, at least for me, last February. So anyway, great to be here, and lovely to see all the excellent work that's going on, and we'll maybe talk about some of that towards the very end, what other things we need to be doing in terms of open science. But all I want to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to just talk a little bit more broadly about pre-registration and the incentive structures and register reports, and some of the things that this series has talked about previously, but also maybe in a little more detail here and there. But of course, our useful starting point is accepting this fact that, as we all know, that the scientific world has changed dramatically, and it changed. Many different factors contributed to it, but certainly from psychological science's point of view, as we all know, in 2015, there was a publication of the key article in the journal Science showing that only 36% or so of psychology or psychological science studies in particular journals could replicate. But this really springboarded, as we know, that replication crisis. And certainly from my own point of view, I've been involved as an advocate of open science in various external roles over the last 5, 6, or 7 years. And I've been keen to try and move the debate forward and move psychological science forward. But the same things in terms of trying to move psychological science forward has the implications for all areas of science. But as we all know, what contributed to the replication crisis or the reproducibility crisis were various different threats to how we go about our business. And as all you will be familiar, I'm sure, if you're not, there's this excellent manifesto for reproducible science by Marcus Manafo and colleagues, in which they articulate very nicely many different questionable research practices which are likely to contribute to the low levels of reproducibility. And again, I'm not going into detail here, but these are things like publication bias, p-hacking, failure to adequately power your studies, hypothesizing after the results are known. So they are the key threats. But from what I've been interested in doing over the last number of years is turning these threats into opportunities. And today, all I want to do is talk about 3 areas where we can turn those threats into opportunities. One is through pre-registration, the second is through registered reports, and the third is through reproducibility of meta-analyses. So let's begin with pre-registration. So again, I know some of you will be familiar with this, but it's worth rehearsing the arguments again. So what is pre-registration? But obviously pre-registration is ultimately planning things way in advance. But crucially, what I think is important to underline is this distinction between confirmatory and exploratory research. So as we know, by pre-registering our studies, planning it all aspects in advance, this means that we can engage in what's called hypothesis testing. So confirmatory research, which is obviously very different then from exploratory research, which is hypothesis generating. And what we all know is that the problem we have in all of science is whenever we present exploratory findings as confirmatory findings. And pre-registration is one crucial way to help reduce that and many other aspects of how we do science. But of course, it's important to highlight that many scientists, myself as a health psychologist, we have been leading the way in the sense of the sort of studies we do. We've been pre-registering aspects of them. So if you run clinical trials in medicine or in health psychology, you've been registering your behavior change interventions on well-established repositories such as clinicaltrials.gov. But we've also been doing excellent jobs, and this is led up the road in New York with Prospero, so where we've been pre-registering our meta-analyses and systematic reviews. But of course, there's still a lot of movement or room for improvement in all of these areas. So I think it's important to recognize the good work that's been going on in many sub areas in science. But if you need any further convincing of the importance of pre-registration, let's look at this great study. I love this paper from back in 2015 by Robert Kaplan. And Kaplan was interested in exploring the impact of the introduction of registration of clinical trials in the United States. And this is looking at studies which particularly funded by organizations in the US, which are to do with heart and lung research. And what's really nice here is, if we look at the left-hand side of this particular graphic, we can see there's a line here, it says pre-2000. So pre-2000, 57% of studies published and funded by that agency found significant benefits for the primary outcome. That's a pretty impressive finding. That drops dramatically to 8% after 2000 when registration becomes mandatory. So that really points to the idea there's a lot of noise out there and potentially lots of false positives, which is particularly concerning if we're working in areas of medicine. So that brings us back to pre-registration. And again, pre-registration can come in many different forms. And particularly I've been using for quite a long time is using as predicted. And as predicted, it's one of the easiest tools that we can use to pre-register our work. Because often what I'm going to talk towards the end of this talk is the idea that many people, there are barriers to people engaging with open science practices. And one of them is they don't understand it or they find it too difficult. As predicted is a really easy tool. All it gets you to do is in advance with your team, you register and you answer these 9 key questions about your study and your plans for your analysis, etc., and what your key hypotheses are. Well, what's crucial is that as predicted allows you, very easily then to create a publicly available document, which will have its own URL, which you can then have there, either make it public or private, but it means that you've thought about in advance and you've registered your hypotheses. But this doesn't prevent you from doing exploratory analysis, which I'll come back to later. But personally, I think that as predicted, and other tools which you can see on the Open Science Framework also allow us during really fast scientific times, such as the crisis we've all lived through in terms of COVID. I would urge colleagues to use as predicted, even for data sets that you may already have collected, because the point, what we found in COVID was people were setting up studies very quickly, which they probably felt they didn't have time to register them in advance. But as part of that overall interest in pre-registration, what myself and a number of colleagues were aware of was that there was no consensus, certainly in psychological science, on common metrics or common ways to pre-register. So I was part of an international task force, which over the last 1.5 to 2 years has tried to come up with what we hope will be a gold standard approach to pre-registration. And this, as I said already, is because pre-registration is an important tool to ensure research transparency. So we decided, let's set up this joint psychological societies pre-registration task force, working with myself and the British Psychological Society, the German Psychological Society, with the Center of Open Science, and another organization in Germany, which are promoters of open science. And we met monthly for the last 1.5 to 2 years, where we looked at all the existing data or approaches to pre-registration. And I'm pleased to say the fruits of our labor have only recently, well, in fact, just very recently have been accepted for publication in the American Psychologist. And for those who are non-psychologists, that's one of the leading journals in the field. So we now have what we call this template for pre-registration of quantitative research. This happens to be in the domain of psychological science, but the key point I would argue is that this particular template is relevant to all areas of science. And those who are interested, you can read the preprint at the link below. But as I say, what was crucial about the PRP quant template was it's allowed us to try and standardize and to give guidance to colleagues on the key aspects of what we think is an international consortium, which are most important, from conflicts of interest and right through to the obvious things about your theoretical background, your hypotheses, and your methods. And then, of course, what we outline in the template is detailed guidance on analysis plans for the future. And I should say that a similar group are now working on a PRP, as it were, for qualitative research, which will hopefully be launched in the near future too. So if you want to download this template to look at it, I think you'll find it of interest. It can be downloaded from this sustainable link here, and it's available in many different formats. That's all I want to say about pre-registration, as maybe your first stop or attempt at open science if you haven't been engaging in these approaches. But next, I want to talk about registered reports. So registered reports are a relatively new phenomenon. They're not that new, as you'll see in a second, but they're new to many scientists still. So what are registered reports? The registered report is a new publication format where peer review happens before the results are known. And this is a really crucial difference. And again, many people listening to this talk, people who are interested in open science, will be familiar with these approaches. So simple idea is that we have an idea, we develop it, we design a study. And once we get to that stage, you then submit that document, that stage 1 article, for peer review. And then once it goes through the standard peer review process where you may be asked to revise, resubmit, or reject it, once you get what's called an in-principle acceptance, then we collect our data, analyze our data, write up the results and discussion, and then this article is then reviewed again. And then the journal will publish this, irrespective of the results. So the crucial point here is that when people like Chris Chambers, who is has been the spearhead, and the person who really has been a world leader in this area, the argument the concern was we wanted to reduce questionable research practices and also reduce the file drawer effect. And again, I urge you to look at this nice article Chris has written recently about the story of registered reports. But more than that, I'll show you in a second, Chris has also written another article very recently about it. But certainly from my own personal point of view, I was keen from psychological scientists' point of view to make sure that we launch this sort of approach across many journals in psychology. And for the last 5 or 6 years, have been the chair of the British Psychological Society's Research Board. So way back in 2017, and actually in 2016, when we launched a pilot version, we then in July 2018 then launched registered reports across all 11 journals that the British Psychological Society publish. And I should say no other international psychological society came close. So we really led the way there to ensure that every single journal in every area of psychology now offers registered reports. And as I argued at the time, the key rationale was that the introduction of registered reports will increase transparency of our science, allow peer review of research studies before the results are known. As a consequence, this will help reduce the use of questionable research practices while crucially improving the quality of our research protocols that will ultimately improve the robustness of our evidence base. And as a health psychologist, I was thrilled to see that after we introduced registered reports across these 11 journals, the first journal to publish one was last March, which was in the British Journal of Health Psychology. So kudos to the health psychologists. Slightly biased there, apologies. So coming back to Chris's work, Chris Chambers' work. So there's a really nice preprint, which again, you can access from the link here, where Chris looks at the history of registered reports and the challenges going forward. And again, I suppose this is just for interest to those on this particular call, is what's really interesting to me is the relative speed to which registered reports have increased. But it's still an alarmingly small number. So if you look back here, this is 2020, there's 275 journals in all areas of science only offering registered reports. And I think that's, indicates that's a huge area for improvement in this regard. But nonetheless, it's still impressive that this trajectory has happened. But it's also interesting to look at who's offering registered reports, which disciplines, which is A, and who's using registered reports. And again, this is a sort of message I think we really all need to spread and get out there is the importance of this approach. Because what we look here is that the social sciences are clearly dominating there's 288 in this slide from Chris, in terms of offering registered reports. There's lots of areas which aren't, and the physical sciences are not offering these sort of reports, and other areas of STEM as well. Life sciences are engaging, as is the intersection between social and life sciences. So clearly there's lots of areas in this university and any other universities where we really need to be pushing forward this argument. And then if we look here at the adopters by field and who's actually publishing these reports. So there's one thing offering the reports, and I should say even in the British Psychological Society's first year or so of offering registered reports across our 11 journals, there was only something like 10, and that's even a maximum, across 11 journals of registered reports submitted. So, many of us are trying our best to change the field by offering these in journals that you're involved in, but the next step is getting people to engage in this process. But again, as you can see here, the social sciences and the intersection between social and health, or the life sciences, are leading the way. But again, I urge you to look at this really excellent preprint by Chambers and colleagues. But if you need any further persuasion on the importance of registered reports, if we really want to have a clean, robust evidence base in any area of science, look at these data. So this is just an example in biomedicine and psychology. This is the first analysis of pre-registered studies. And what it shows, again, is a sharp increase in null findings. And I've presented this slide many times before, but I'm always blown away by this aspect. So this is when you take a random sample of studies in the general literature, and you look to see whether or not hypotheses have been supported or not. Amazingly, if you look at the most extreme example, most studies are showing 95% of published research is showing that the hypothesis, the primary hypothesis, is accepted. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary finding. And as I've said before in other meetings, we're really not that good as scientists. And what's interesting when you introduce registered reports, that drops to for the not supported, you go to about 55%, and when it's a replication study, 66%. So 2 important points here. One is, it's an extraordinarily high rate if you don't have registered reports, which suggests there's lots of false positives out there. That's the file drawer effect. But also, it's important not to underestimate that null findings are equally as important in times, particularly in medicine or in areas of clinical importance. So null findings can be equally as informative. But the other example of, which I think is hugely persuasive, again, it's come from psychological science, really nice paper very recently published by Schnell and colleagues in the Netherlands, where they've looked at a random sample of 152 standard papers in key psychology journals. Again, same deal, nearly all of them supporting the first hypothesis. But now with the very first detailed investigation of 71 registered reports, just look how that drops to less than 50%, around 40% have their primary hypothesis supported. So hopefully this convinces you, as this title suggests, that there's an excess of positive results out there. So what are the barriers to uptake? So as I've alluded to before, in my experience of working across the British Psychological Society journals, we have a relatively slow uptake. And there's a number of barriers which I've personally heard anecdotally, such as, well, it's not a barrier in the sense that I've heard. Many people still are unaware of registered reports as a format. And actually, interestingly, there was an article in Nature or Science a couple of weeks ago, which was quite critical of these new formats, suggesting that they should be limited to areas where there's a major replication crisis. My view is that most areas, if not all areas of science, will benefit from these new approaches. But ultimately, we need to improve awareness. The idea that registered reports will stifle creativity, again, is completely incorrect, because the idea is that all we do is, in any area of pre-registration, we pre-register the hypotheses that we're testing as confirmatory, but that does not in any way prevent us from engaging in exploratory analyses, as long as it's labeled as such. So no room for stifled creativity, no room for being scooped, because ultimately, when you have a registered report, the stage 1 in principle accepted article will be available, timestamped. It can be made publicly available or not. You can hold until after it's published, which most people will. But the key point is you can't be scooped. I think more importantly, is going to talk about very briefly towards the end in a couple of minutes, is people are resistant to these changing working practices. So it's an exciting new tool. This is just a complete plug for a journal that I've recently taken over the editorialship of. And the reason why I took it over is because I want this journal to become a one-stop shop for open science in the broad area of in mainstream psychology. And we're offering all types of, we encourage pre-registration, registered reports, but we also encourage brief replication reports as well, to try and ensure that all areas of psychological science and all areas of open science are welcome. So I want to briefly just talk to you about the final thing, and then I want to just finish by talking about the whole architecture of science and how that and the incentive structure. But before I do it, let's a brief mention about meta-analyses. This is a really nice paper published in JAMA a number of years ago now, and which clearly argues, well, we all know that meta-analyses should be the cornerstone of cumulative science. But is that the case? So we get this idea, if the data entering into the meta-analysis is incorrect, then what we're receiving out the other end may also be incorrect. And this nice paper here shows that if looking at a random sample of 27 meta-analyses, these authors were able to show that nearly 37% of these meta-analyses had errors in them. In particular, the standard mean difference, one of the key outcomes in the meta-analysis of interest. 63% other errors were identified. And even more alarmingly, as they conclude, these errors that they identified, when you reanalyze the data, meant that there was a negation of the original conclusions or a reversal of the actual findings. And indeed, Daniel Lakens has written about this recently. In fact, I've written about this as well in a more recent article, where they argue that meta-analysis is another area I've talked about it here in behavioral medicine or in health psychology, but all areas of science where we can improve our transparency, our reproducibility by being open and fair in those classic FAIR guidelines. So I'm not going to go into details here, but the key point I'm flagging is there's a huge area of science where we really need to improve our methods and our approaches. And indeed, a nice article here, which gives you a tutorial in how you can conduct meta-analyses in the age of open science. And you can Google this particular article, but and you can read the preprint freely available. So 2 final things I want to talk about in the last 10 minutes are, I want to talk about science as behavior. Because I think this is really important to all of us as advocates of open science and people who want to change scientific practices in the long run. And this, again, if you want to read a bit more detail, there's an article I've written my colleague Emma Norris, who was at UCL at the time, who's now at Brunel, where we as health psychologists were interested in this idea that we, in fact, as psychologists generally, we know a lot about behavior change. In fact, this has been, a huge thing in terms of how we understand and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. But why don't we apply what we understand about behavior change to how we change and promote uptake of open science? And one of the central models, which again, some of you may be familiar with, is what's called the COM-B model of understanding behavior. Because ultimately, all of open science and all of scientific behavior is a series of small behaviors. P-hacking is a behavior. Pre-printing is a behavior. Registering protocol is a behavior. But what we know is that behavior is governed by capability, opportunity, and motivation. And what we should do is use our techniques that we know about behavior change to influence each of these components of the COM-B model. And again, I'm only just touching on this. Those who are interested can read our article. But at the center of a lot of behavior change and a lot of the COVID pandemic response is what's called the behavior change wheel. And this was put forward by Susan Mickey and colleagues back in 2011. But what's interesting here, and why I'm flagging it to you today, is that at the center here is this COM-B, right? This capability, opportunity, and motivation. But if we want to influence each of these crucial aspects which influence behavior, we then look at what are called intervention functions, things like how do we train colleagues? How do we persuade people to engage in open science? Modeling, there's lots of different techniques. Here's an example of open science behaviors, using open data, open notebooks, open source, using scientific social networks, registering your work. Again, there's lots of different components of open science. But what can we do? Well, again, this is a great slide from Emma, where what we've briefly summarized here, and we talk about it in the paper, is this notion that if you look at all these different aspects of all these things that we can do to target open science behaviors and changing open science uptake, it could be persuasion, it could be, reproducibility is an example of how we persuade people through using communication and inducing, it could be through positive and negative communications. We can have things like increasing knowledge through education. We can have obviously changing the social and physical context, which is changing the environmental function, the structure about open science framework and different psychology or scientific societies. It can be how through we use reward and incentivization, which are crucial factors that we'll talk about in a second. So there's many different aspects, and I think all of us as open science advocates, because that's probably why you're listening to this today, is we all have a role to play here, and we should identify these different components and think, what can we do to target? And a lot of it, in fact, this very session, the open lunch session, is a great example of persuasion and education and training and also enablement. I'll leave that for a sec. So the final thing I just want to move on to in the last 8 minutes or so, if I've got my timings right, is this article I've written recently. It was published late last year, and everything pretty much what I've said today is in this article. It says Leonardo da Vinci. I'm very much extending science has gone through a renaissance analogy. So it's if you want to read more about that, you can read the article, which is freely available. But in this article, as well as trying to promote pre-registration, I also talk about, as others have as well, this idea of the architecture of science. And what we all probably agree is the architecture of science and incentivization is broken. And there's lots that all of us, I think, have a responsibility to try and change through both bottom-up and top-down processes. And there's been a number of colleagues have been arguing about how we can go about doing that. And Marcus Manafo been one of the leading voices in this area, as well as many other colleagues. But I really like this particular article by Marcus back in 2019. And this is the notion where he suggests we need collective action. And this is, we all agree that given that we've got the publish and perish culture still exists in universities, predominantly in universities where promotions are very much driven by the number of papers, it's about quantity and not quality, and about the number of grants you get. It's about fast science and not slow science, which I'll talk about in the next slide or two. But as Marcus has said here, funding, appointments, promotions, tenure, prizes, every aspect of academic and scientific endeavor is linked in some way to not about teamwork, but individual work. It's about promoting quantity and not quality. So we really need to change the overall structure, and that also means we need to promote open science practices. And open research should be something we reward in our promotion applications and in both internally and externally in terms of how funding bodies award grants as well. And an easy way of doing that is the great work by the UK Reproducibility Network. And we've got, and Ike is on the call here today, and we've got our representative here in Leeds. But one thing certainly myself and Ike have been trying to do over the last couple of years, and we're trying to push it further, is for the University of Leeds, as well as other universities, to continue to sign up formally to all the principles of the UK Reproducibility Network. And those of you who aren't aware, what I really like of this approach is it is again, a bottom-up, top-down approach. So it gives you the tools to, primers on open science and support networks and regular meetings. But also the idea we've got at hopefully all universities, you will have an open UKRN lead, but also the idea of UKRN is also can be top down as well to influence government, funding agencies and universities. But really this is a national peer-led consortium, which I think is a really exciting prospect, but it will become more exciting when we have more colleagues signing up to it and more universities and key stakeholders. But I want to just finish on this particular slide. Now there's two slides. One is this really nice article by Uta Frith, and many of you may not be familiar with Uta Frith is, but Uta Frith is a hugely influential developmental psychological scientist. And Uta has been, world leading in her own area of science, but she wrote this article last year where she very much influenced this, or sent the whole argument by, through the comparison again, as others have as well, between fast and slow science. So the publish and perish approach promotes fast science. What we really want to be doing, as she argues here, is she makes it very clear that fast science is bad for scientists. It's bad for science. Slow science may actually help us make faster progress, but what can we do to slow it down? And really that's what we need to move to. And many different ways are argued. I talk about them in that paper, Uta does here, and many others do elsewhere. It is about reproducible science. It is about not, having in your incentive structure changing so that it's quality and not quantity. It is about promoting teamwork and not individual superstardom. And what's really nice is this very inspiring example from Utrecht University. And funny, I saw this last night on Twitter by Echo's tweet, but also I also know that our own university open science colleagues, Nick and colleagues, have retweeted with this as well. Utrecht have changed dramatically the structure of recognition and rewards. The fact they've got a slide like this speaks volumes. And two things I want to just flag on before I draw some very brief conclusions. One is changing the influence from the individual performance and your output metrics from quantity, closed, H-index, impact factors, funding received, to a team effort, which has got a large range of diversification, but which respects quality, openness, and society relevance as well as impact. So thanks for listening. I've just got 2 minutes left. What are my take-home messages? First one is that pre-registration is a very straightforward tool that we can all engage with that will improve transparency. Registered reports are a really important tool, I believe, that will improve science, and I think they're here to stay, and that whole landscape is improving and changing every day and every week as we go forward. We should also see science as a series of behaviors, and all of us have a responsibility to adopt one new open science practice. And certainly, myself, pre-registration is a crucial area in which I think many of us can engage in very easily. But also, there's responsibility from all areas of science to improve and change the incentive structure and the architecture of science if we really want to improve the cumulative evidence base that we have in all areas of science to make it more reliable and more robust. But crucially, I finish every single talk I give in the area of open science by reminding all of us how exciting a time it is. If you're an early career researcher at this time, in fact, I feel envious of you, because at this moment in time, there are so many exciting balls in the area from different analytical approaches to different areas of statistical approaches to how we publish science, that you really can grab one of those balls and run with it. So it's an exciting time, and I'm looking forward to see how things develop over the next number of years. So thank you very much. I think I've spoken for exactly the right amount of time, and anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daryl. That was indeed the precise amount of time. So anybody who's in the chat, please do type any questions, or if you'd like to come onto the microphone, let us know in the chat and we can invite you onto the microphone. Perhaps just to get us started, Daryl, just listening to your presentation, which was great. Thank you very much. What struck me, and talking to other people about open research, psychology, psychological sciences, you've been real trailblazers in the area. And I wondered what is it about the discipline of psychology that's led you to inflict this kind of level of scrutiny on yourself? And how do we make sure that it doesn't become as an area too closely associated with psychology? I was just looking at the task force for the pre-registration standards, which looks fantastic, that template. Presumably that template would have relevance to many areas, not just within the psychological sciences.
Absolutely, Rachel. Lots in there. Really great question. I mean, one thing I didn't do was spend the early part of the talk talking about psychology's role in it. I mean, what's crucial to me is, you're absolutely right, psychology has been a trailblazer. And interestingly, I haven't referenced that we did a number of events at the Royal Society, which I organized back in 2016 and then back 2018 with some of the key players. And when I gave a presentation at that, my talk was psychological science as a trailblazer for all of science. And the reason is because psychology, there was a number of, well, crucially, we can track it back to a number of key papers, but back in 2015, there was this replication project, which is a multi-lab endeavor, which basically identified that only 36% of 100 of these articles replicated, all right? And they replicated with a weaker effect size. And what was really impressive, key people like Brian Nozak, who in fact, interestingly, I've worked with on a number of these different projects over the years, in the sense that Brian, we've invited him to speak at these events and different areas. Brian is a psychological scientist who ultimately set up the open science framework with other colleagues. And they recognized that there was room for greater transparency. But other non-psychologists and many people in other areas have been shouting similarly as well. But what's impressive with psychology was they said, right, you are right. It's time for us to really embrace this. And so we did this. So we said, instead of navel gazing, psychology said, right, we are going to look at this. We're going to move forward with it. And so we've set up other different ways, like the pre-registration, registered reports. And as a result, and I should also say, psychology wasn't the only area which has replication problems. Every single areas of science has a replication problem. And, at some level, with higher or lower levels, genetics, clinical medicine, all these areas have, but with psychology, they embraced that. So, and as a result of the changes that psychological science have made, And in fact, a lot of the key players in this field, you know, Brian knows that, even in the UK, Marcus Manafo, Chris Chambers, they are all psychologists. But again, the ideas are generally equally as relevant to everyone. And similarly with the registration, the pre-registration task force, again, that was working with the open science framework. But crucially, that was with an eye on that all areas of science could take the same approach. I know in political science, there's something similar happening. But I think final point I'll say on that was basically all of us have, you know, all areas of science are not immune from this, and we can all learn from what psychology has done. And I don't think psychology will be. You know, bottom line is when I see papers now in terms of pre-registration, you look at the open science badges, that's not just about psychology, it's about all areas of science can use the same approaches. That's a bit of a meandering answer, but I hope I cover most of it.
No, it's really interesting, and I think, you know, that the evidence presented about the risk of false positives, which obviously can have consequences, huge consequences across lots of different areas, is really compelling, if a little scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I've got a question here. Sorry, Daryl.
No, I was just going to do that. I was just going to say, Rachel, there's a great question here from Kelly. Hi, Kelly. I think, you know, such an important point here, because again, it's a reasonably short period of time, but, you know, there's always these question marks. Another major barrier is, can I do this in my PhD, particularly registered reports? So Kelly, you may know, you know, one of my students is already, Olivia, is doing a registered report. You're right. I mean, some people suggest it could take longer, but I think that that's a bit of a false concern. It can take longer, but if you look at the recent paper by Chris Chambers that I've cited in the talk, Chris makes a very clear point that actually it's going to speed up very quickly, and you can still engage in it, but I think you really have to be quick off the mark. But interestingly, you're guaranteed the publication as well. So I would encourage people to do it, but maybe do it early. Any advice about going about it? Yeah, be early, be thoughtful, work, you know, also think about working with teams as well to help you do that. And then the other thing is, if you can't do it as a registered report, I would urge people to very much engage in the pre-registration process. So hopefully, Kelly, it's helpful, and I know you're a supporter anyway. So a great question. There.
So Daryl, are you going to? There's another question there from Marcin about.
Please comment a little more on how explorative science is factored into registration. Absolutely, brilliant question. So that's just a simple fact on how you label it. So in a registered report, you'll have your pre-registered hypotheses, and you'll very clearly say in your registered report, this is what these are the analysis, this is the analysis plan, and you'll report those results. All you do when you get your exploratory analysis, you'll say exploratory analyses. Here's what these are not pre-planned, these are exploratory, and they require replication. So all it is about making sure you do not label hypothesis, you know, testing findings as hypothesis generating or exploratory. So that's all you do. Very, very straightforward way of dealing with it. And could putting exploratory science prehistory actually increase probability of getting scooped? No, I don't think so. In fact, if anything, if you include them in your report, that means that you've got them there, guaranteed out there as yours, badged in that report, so you can't be scooped. Phil, thanks, Phil. Just wondering if you thought.
Yeah, while you read that, Daryl, I'll just say that training and embedding training, because at the beginning, Nick was reflecting on the various sessions that we've had, and this has been an ongoing area of discussion. So this is interesting that Phil is bringing in undergraduates, and we've got examples from one of the previous talks where undergraduates were involved in kind of scrutinizing methodology. So there's Phil's question there, and I wondered if you've come across any examples, Daryl, good examples of embedding these key skills, either at undergraduate level or even at sort of Centre for Doctoral Training or, you know, PGR training level.
Well, certainly I know in psychology in our own school that in all levels we've also tried to include, we've now started at different levels introducing the issues to do with open science. I know other universities like Glasgow, where I was the external examiner, they've also embedded it into different aspects of their training. I think we just need to continue doing that. It should be, you know, it should be mandatory. And in fact, I should say certainly in the British Psychological Society, which is a registered and recognized degree, that you have to do certain, fulfill certain criteria to become a registered or chartered psychologist in terms of the training. One of the things that we've introduced recently is now it's included that open science principles need to be embedded in that. So I think we should be doing that at all levels, and all disciplines, as much as they can, should include open science principles and training there. And again, I can see Nick is also putting some great links there into the chat as well about examples of this. So yeah, I think that's really important. And actually I think Doctoral Training College should be doing it as well. And I mean, funding agencies, if you look to the United States, look at NIH, you have to have clear statements on open science and transparency and replication and those sort of issues in many of these applications. And I know it's the same here in the UK, and it's moving in a bit more detail.
Great. A slightly different kind of question. I don't think there's another question come up. Actually, Andrew's saying, thinking about behaviour change, are there differences in how to represent things like registered reports to established PIs versus new PhD students? So I guess this is recognising where, yes, the different kind of career stages.
Absolutely, and Andrew, it's a great point. I remember weirdly being in Vienna a couple of years ago at a conference, and it was a big open science session. There were jam-packed 200 people in the room, I reckon, and there was lots of, Daniel Lackins was giving talk on some of this meta-analysis stuff. Other key players were presenting, and I looked around the room, and the average age of people in that room was probably about 30, and it speaks to that point, Andrew, which is there's still more established researchers are slower in the uptake. So I think you're right. It's about challenging. So you're right, the behavior change wheel, we think about it, there's different ways of doing it and how we incentivize it. And actually, you're right, I think some people think it slows things down, you're talking about registered reports in particular. So I think one is we do need to think about it to present it, we need to speed up the whole process, but also there's a whole movement now about linking registered reports to funding, to your grant application. And actually that is an exciting way forward. So if you're a PI and you're required, one of the things in your application is to present it as a registered report, one of the key aspects. And if you're successfully funded, at the same time you also get your report accepted, then that would very much incentivize PIs. So I think there's work to be done there. You're absolutely right. And also I think there's is also shown as the framework for open and reproducible research training. Yeah, there's lots of really exciting things there. And Ike, you're talking about, yeah, there's another link, yeah, Ike, as well, to the primers. Yeah, the UK RN Open Research Primers. No, Ike, you may have been involved. One of them is, I think, are a really nice resource for anybody who hasn't seen them.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe, well, we're coming towards the end of the session, so I've got one question, and then maybe we could move on to just say a few concluding things about the UK Reproducibility Network. Either yourself, Daryl, or maybe Ike, you might want to come to the mic. But before we do that, one of the questions that we'd had in our minds is whether there is any kind of tension between this really interesting idea of slow science and registering and considering, and maybe some of the messages that we're giving in terms of preprints and getting stuff out there fast and having fast impact. So it was really interesting to hear that consideration, the Frith work about balancing fast and slow. But is there a risk there that we're emphasizing the speed by emphasizing preprints? How do we balance that?
No, that's a really great question, Rachel, particularly in the context of coming through COVID, where preprints were hugely important. I mean, there is a balance to be struck there. I think it's contextual and time dependent. So in a crisis like COVID, preprints may be a bit more relevant. But there is a concern, making sure it's clear that these haven't been peer reviewed. But the idea of the fast, slow thing is a slightly different thing. The point is, it's about how we incentivize in the university. And, you look at applications. I remember when I was an early career researcher, it was about getting publications. It wasn't always about quality. It was about quantity. So I think as soon as we change that, and we also say, have you engaged in, we should have a thing in an application which says, can you demonstrate where you've engaged in open science and open research methods? And that should be there. And it should be at every stage, grade 10, grade 9, grade 8, grades 7, 6, all of us should be doing it. So I think, and also emphasizing teamwork and not just the individual superstar. I think that model is moving on, but I think by changing those sort of things, that will hopefully over time naturally offset that balance.
Thank you. Yeah, let's hope so. It's, like you say, interesting and exciting times, which can be quite challenging as well. And behavioural change is always, really challenging. But talking of behavioural change and getting involved and doing the right thing, are there any sort of final remarks you might want to make about getting involved with the UK Reproducibility Network? And Ike, I don't know if you want to say anything about the links that you've posted in the chat as Daryl's been presenting.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel, for the opportunity. My main message is for all of you on the call to click the links if you're interested in what you've just heard, just to join our community of people interested in at Leeds in the very topics that Daryl has so nicely discussed in this session. So do join us if you want more of that. There's no commitment attached to that whatsoever. So the threshold to your own behavioral change should be low there. I can post it again. We will launch next week. That's maybe perhaps worthwhile sort of previewing. We will launch next week the new Microsoft team that's dedicated to UKRN at Leeds. And if you want to be invited to that team, just fill out the form and we'll put you on.
Thanks, Ike. And Daryl, so in terms of becoming involved with the UK Reproducibility Network or changing behaviours, what's kind of one thing we're being encouraged to do? At least one thing. Do one thing. What's that one thing that we should be doing?
I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, so I would urge you to read the article I've written on it, because I start this article and I say, by the time you finish reading this article, if you can just choose one thing, and it doesn't matter what that one thing is. It could be deciding to post a preprint. It could be about deciding to use as predicted. So just small steps are important. So if you're not engaging in any open science at all, then be sure to just do one small thing and then think how you can move forward in that regard. I think that's the key aspect here.
I think that's really important and positive message, and maybe we could draw a conclusion there because we're on the hour. Thank you so much, Daryl, and thank you everybody who's contributed to the comments and questions. Nick, have you got any final kind of farewell words?
Just say no, thank you to Daryl and thank you to everybody for coming along and contributing. So as I say, we will be running more of these sessions next year. Really interested to hear from anybody, with or without the university, around the types of subject we can cover. And you're always welcome to speak and, get in touch with us on Twitter or wherever. And thanks very much and have a good day. I was just only slightly confused as to Daryl's take-home messages because I'm already at home. So apart from that,
take home in a pandemic message.
Yeah, I'll take them back to the university if we ever get back in. So thanks, Daryl.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks for the invite. Lovely to see you all.